Margaret's wrinkled hands trembled as she approached the towering iron gates. The mansion loomed behind them, a monument to wealth and power. She smoothed her simple gray dress and took a deep breath. This was just another job, she told herself, just another rich family to serve. The gates creaked open, and Margaret shuffled up the long driveway. Her sensible shoes crunched on the gravel as she made her way to the front door. Before she could knock, it swung open, revealing a tall, imposing man with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes. "You're late," he snapped, checking his expensive watch. "I expect punctuality from all my staff." Margaret swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rothschild, it won't happen again." Alexander Rothschild, tech mogul and one of the richest men in the country, looked her up and down with disdain. "See that it doesn't. Come in, I'll show you around." As Margaret followed him into the cavernous foyer, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of familiarity. Something about the way he walked, the set of his shoulders. She shook her head. Foolish thoughts. She was just an old woman, and he was her employer. Nothing more. Alexander led her through room after opulent room, rattling off her duties in a clipped tone. "You'll dust daily, vacuum twice a week, and ensure all surfaces are spotless. I expect fresh linens on all beds every other day. The kitchen must be immaculate at all times. Any questions?" Margaret shook her head, trying to take it all in. It was by far the largest home she'd ever worked in, but the basics were the same. Clean, organize, make things shine. She could handle that. As they entered the study, Margaret's eye was drawn to a delicate china teacup on the desk. It was decorated with hand-painted violets, just like the set her grandmother had owned. A lump formed in her throat as memories flooded back. Afternoons spent sipping tea with her Nana, learning to embroider, talking about boys. "Is there a problem?" Alexander's sharp voice cut through her reverie. Margaret blinked rapidly. "No, sir, I just admired your teacup. It's lovely." A flicker of something, surprise, crossed Alexander's face before his usual scowl returned. "Yes, well, I have a fondness for certain teas. Speaking of which, you'll need to learn how to brew them properly. I'm very particular." As the tour continued, Margaret found her thoughts drifting to the past, to the child she'd given up all those years ago. Would he be Alexander's age now? Would he have the same success, the same wealth? Or had his life taken a different path entirely? The following weeks fell into a routine. Margaret arrived early each morning, going about her tasks with quiet efficiency. She learned Alexander's quirks and preferences, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. Though he remained brusque and demanding, she sensed a gradual softening in his manner. One morning, as Margaret was dusting the library shelves, she noticed Alexander pacing in his study, muttering to himself. His agitation was palpable. Without thinking, she knocked gently on the open door. "Excuse me, Mr. Rothschild. I was about to make some tea. Would you care for a cup?" Alexander looked up, startled. For a moment, his mask of cool indifference slipped, revealing a vulnerability that made Margaret's heart ache. Yes, that would be nice. Thank you." Margaret nodded and retreated to the kitchen. She selected the violet-patterned cup and saucer, brewing a perfect pot of Earl Grey, Alexander's favorite. When she returned to the study, he was staring out the window, lost in thought. "Your tea, sir," she said softly, placing the tray on his desk. Alexander turned, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the familiar cup. He picked it up, inhaling the fragrant steam. This is exactly how I like it. How did you know?" Margaret smiled. "I pay attention, Mr. Rothschild. It's part of my job." As Alexander sipped his tea, his shoulders visibly relaxed. "You know, Margaret, I've had many housekeepers over the years, but none quite like you." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing, sir?" Margaret asked, a hint of humor in her voice. Alexander's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "A good thing, I think. A very good thing." As Margaret turned to leave, Alexander cleared his throat. "Margaret, would you mind staying for a moment? I could use someone to talk to." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Of course, Mr. Rothschild. I'd be happy to listen." Alexander gestured to a chair. "Please sit, and you can call me Alexander, when we're alone at least." Margaret sat, smoothing her apron nervously. "What's troubling you, Alexander?" He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "It's this new project I'm working on. It could revolutionize the tech industry, but I'm not sure I'm the right person to lead it." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes kind. "Why do you say that?" "Because—" Alexander hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Because I'm not who everyone thinks I am. This empire, this success, it's all built on a lie." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Alexander stood pacing the room. "I wasn't born into wealth and privilege. I grew up in the foster care system, bounced from home to home. I changed my name, created a whole new identity when I started my company. No one knows the truth." Margaret's mind reeled. Could it be possible? Could this man, this brilliant, difficult man, be the child she'd given up so long ago? "Alexander," she said gently, "having a difficult start in life doesn't make you any less deserving of success. In fact, I'd say it makes your achievements even more impressive." He turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "You really believe that?" Margaret nodded. "I do. And I think the fact that you're questioning yourself, that you want to do right by others, that shows true character." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then, to Margaret's surprise, he smiled. A real, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Thank you, Margaret. I'm glad you're here." As Margaret left the study, her heart was pounding. She had so many questions, so many hopes. But now wasn't the time. For now, she would simply be there, offering what support she could to this man who might, just might be her long-lost son. "Margaret," Alexander called out as she reached the door. She turned back. "Yes." "Do you think—" He paused, looking uncertain. "Do you think we could have tea together again tomorrow? I'd like to hear more about your life, if you're willing to share." Margaret smiled, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I'd like that very much, Alexander. Very much indeed." As Margaret entered Alexander's study the next afternoon, a steaming teapot and 2 cups on her tray, she found him lost in thought, staring at an old photograph. "Is everything all right?" she asked, setting down the tray. Alexander startled, quickly tucking the photo into a drawer. "Yes, fine, just remembering." He cleared his throat. "You mentioned you'd tell me about your life." Margaret nodded, pouring the tea. "Where would you like me to start?" "The beginning," Alexander said, leaning forward. "Tell me everything." Margaret took a deep breath, the aroma of Earl Grey filling her senses. "Well, I was born in a small town, not far from here." As Margaret shared her story, Alexander listened intently, his usual mask of indifference slipping away. She told him about her childhood on a farm, her dreams of becoming a teacher, and the twist of fate that led her to a life of service instead. When she reached her teenage years, Margaret hesitated. The pain of giving up her child still felt fresh, even after 5 decades. But something in Alexander's eyes encouraged her to continue. "I was young," she said softly. "Too young to raise a child on my own. The father, he wasn't in the picture. My parents were furious. They arranged for a private adoption, told everyone I'd gone to live with an aunt for a year." Alexander's knuckles were white as he gripped his teacup. "That must have been incredibly difficult." Margaret nodded, blinking back tears. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I wanted him to have a better life than I could provide." "Him?" Alexander's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, a boy." Margaret smiled sadly. "I only saw him once, just after he was born. He had the most beautiful blue eyes." Alexander abruptly stood, turning to face the window. His shoulders were tense, his breathing uneven. Margaret watched him, her heart racing. Could he be putting the pieces together? "I'm sorry," Alexander said finally, his voice rough. "I didn't mean to react so strongly. It's just, your story reminds me of my own past." Margaret set down her cup, her hands trembling. "Oh." Alexander turned back to her, his expression vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "I was adopted as an infant. I never knew my birth parents." The air in the room seemed to grow thick. Margaret struggled to keep her voice steady. Have you ever tried to find them? Alexander shook his head. No, I was angry for a long time, felt abandoned. It's taken me years to understand that giving me up might have been an act of love. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. She longed to tell him the truth, to bridge the gap between them. But fear held her back. What if she was wrong? What if he rejected her? Margaret. Alexander's voice was gentle. Are you all right? She wiped her eyes, forcing a smile. Yes, I'm fine. Your story just touched me. I hope you know that your birth mother must have loved you very much. Alexander's expression softened. Thank you. I'm beginning to believe that might be true. As the weeks passed, Margaret and Alexander's tea times became a daily ritual. They shared stories, hopes, and fears. Margaret saw a side of Alexander few others ever glimpsed, the insecure boy beneath the confident exterior, the kind heart hidden behind gruff manners. One afternoon, as Margaret was tidying Alexander's bedroom, she noticed a small box tucked away on a high shelf. Curiosity got the better of her, and she carefully opened it. Inside, she found a worn baby blanket and a small silver rattle. Her heart stopped. The blanket. It was the one she'd wrapped her son in before handing him over. She'd embroidered a tiny violet in one corner, a secret message of love. What are you doing? Margaret whirled around to find Alexander in the doorway, his face a mix of anger and fear. I'm so sorry, she stammered. I shouldn't have. I was just dusting and… Alexander strode forward, snatching the box from her hands. These are private. You had no right. Margaret flinched at his tone. I'm truly sorry, Alexander. I didn't mean to pry. It's just… that blanket. What about it? Alexander snapped, clutching the box to his chest. Margaret took a deep breath. It was now or never. I think I might know where it came from. Alexander's eyes narrowed. That's impossible. This was given to me by my birth mother. No one else could possibly… His voice trailed off as realization dawned. He staggered back, sinking onto the edge of the bed. No, he whispered. It can't be. Margaret stepped forward, her heart pounding. Alexander, I think you might be my son. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander stared at her, his face a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, disbelief, anger, hope. They all flashed across his features in rapid succession. How? He finally managed. How can you be sure? Margaret gently took the blanket from the box, running her fingers over the embroidered violet. I made this. For my baby boy. The one I gave up 50 years ago. Alexander's breath hitched. This can't be happening. You're my housekeeper. You can't be my… Mother, Margaret finished softly. I know it's a lot to take in. I've suspected for a while, but I wasn't certain until I saw this blanket. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing the room. Why didn't you say something sooner? Why work as my housekeeper? Was this all some kind of trick? Margaret shook her head vehemently. No, Alexander. I had no idea when I took this job. It wasn't until I started working here, noticing little things about you, that I began to suspect. But I couldn't be sure, and I was afraid. Afraid of what? Alexander demanded. Afraid you'd reject me, Margaret admitted. Afraid I'd lose what little relationship we'd built. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness or your love. I wanted you to know the truth. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, his eyes wild. I need time to process this. I can't deal with this right now. He strode towards the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. Without turning, he spoke in a low voice. I think it's best if you take some time off, Margaret. Paid leave. I'll be in touch. With that, he was gone, leaving Margaret alone in the room, clutching the baby blanket to her chest as tears streamed down her face. As she slowly made her way downstairs, her mind reeling from the revelation, she heard Alexander's voice drift from his study. Cancel all my appointments for the next week, he was saying into his phone. I need some time to deal with a personal matter. Margaret's heart ached. She'd finally found her son, but at what cost? As Margaret stepped out of the mansion, the weight of her revelation pressed heavily on her shoulders. The cool autumn air nipped at her face, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and change. She paused at the gate, looking back at the grand house that had become more than just a workplace. It had become the setting for a reunion she'd only dreamed of for 50 years. Days passed with no word from Alexander. Margaret alternated between hope and despair, replaying their last conversation over and over in her mind. Had she made a mistake in revealing the truth? Should she have kept her suspicions to herself? On the 5th day of her imposed leave, Margaret's phone rang. Her heart leapt when she saw Alexander's name on the screen. "Hello?" she answered, her voice trembling. "Margaret." Alexander's voice was gruff but not unkind. "Can you meet me at the park near the mansion? There's a bench by the old oak tree." "Of course," Margaret replied, already reaching for her coat. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." The park was quiet when Margaret arrived, most people deterred by the chilly weather. She spotted Alexander sitting on the bench, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on the ground. As she approached, he looked up, and the vulnerability in his gaze nearly broke her heart. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Margaret lowered herself onto the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Thank you for calling. I've been so worried." Alexander nodded, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on his knee. "I've done a lot of thinking these past few days. About my childhood, my adoption, the kind of man I've become." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And about you." Margaret waited, hardly daring to breathe. "I had you investigated," Alexander continued, and Margaret's heart sank. Of course he had. It was the logical thing to do. "Everything you told me checks out. The dates, the location, even the private adoption agency my parents used." "I would never lie to you about this, Alexander," Margaret said softly. He turned to face her, his blue eyes, so like her own, searching her face. "I believe you, which means you really are my mother." The word hung in the air between them, full of weight and possibility. Margaret felt tears welling up and blinked them back. "Yes, I am." Alexander ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Margaret now recognized as a sign of his inner turmoil. "I don't know how to feel about this. Part of me is angry. Angry that you gave me up. Angry that you kept the truth from me when you first suspected. But another part—" He trailed off, and Margaret gently prompted, "Another part?" "Another part of me is relieved," Alexander admitted. "To finally know where I came from. To understand why I never felt like I fit in with my adoptive family, as kind as they were." Margaret's hand twitched, longing to reach out and comfort him, but she held back. "I'm so sorry for any pain I've caused you, Alexander. Giving you up was the hardest decision I've ever made. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought of you, wondered about you." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, processing her words. Then, to Margaret's surprise, he let out a small chuckle. "It's ironic, isn't it? All these years I've been searching for something, never quite knowing what. And it turns out what I was looking for was right under my nose, dusting my bookshelves and making my tea." Margaret couldn't help but smile. Life has a funny way of bringing people together sometimes. "Indeed it does," Alexander agreed. He turned to face her fully. "I can't promise you anything, Margaret. I don't know if I'll ever be able to see you as a mother, but I'd like to try to get to know you. The real you, not just my housekeeper." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. "I'd like that very much, Alexander. Thank you." Hesitantly, Alexander reached out and patted her hand. The gesture was awkward, but it was a start. "So," he said, his voice lighter than before, "tell me something about yourself that I don't already know." Margaret thought for a moment, then smiled. "Well, believe it or not, I once dreamed of being a jazz singer." Alexander's eyebrows shot up. "You're joking." "Not at all," Margaret laughed. "I used to sneak out to clubs when I was a teenager. I even performed a few times under a stage name." "Now this I have to hear more about," Alexander said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. As they sat on that park bench, sharing stories and tentatively building a new kind of relationship, neither Margaret nor Alexander noticed the man watching them from behind a nearby tree. The observer pulled out his phone, quickly snapping a few photos before slipping away. The next morning, Margaret was awakened by a frantic call from Alexander. "Turn on the news," he said without preamble. "Now." Confused and alarmed, Margaret fumbled for her remote. As the TV flickered to life, her heart sank. There, splashed across the screen, was a photo of her and Alexander in the park. The headline read, "Tech mogul's secret past exposed. Long-lost mother revealed to be housekeeper." "Oh no," Margaret breathed. "Alexander, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." "I know," Alexander's voice was tight with stress. "But it has happened, and now we need to deal with it. Can you come to the mansion? We need to formulate a response." As Margaret hurried to get dressed, her mind raced. How had the press found out? What would this mean for Alexander's company, his reputation? And what would it mean for their fragile, newfound relationship? When she arrived at the mansion, she found it surrounded by reporters and photographers. Security guards escorted her inside, where she found Alexander pacing in his study, phone pressed to his ear. "No comment at this time," he was saying firmly. "We'll release a statement when we're ready. Until then, I expect you to respect our privacy." He hung up and turned to Margaret, his face a mask of tension. "This is a nightmare. The press is having a field day. My board of directors is in an uproar, and social media is exploding with speculation." Margaret's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Alexander. What can I do to help?" He sighed, sinking into his chair. "I don't know. I've spent years cultivating a certain image, building this company from nothing. Now it feels like it's all crumbling around me." Margaret moved closer, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're still the same brilliant, driven man you were yesterday. This doesn't change that." Alexander looked up at her, conflict clear in his eyes. "Doesn't it? My whole life has been built on the idea that I came from nothing, that I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. Now everyone knows I had a secret mother all along." "Alexander," Margaret said firmly, "finding out about me doesn't negate your achievements. You did build this company from nothing. You did overcome tremendous odds. The only difference is, now people will know the full extent of what you've overcome." He was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Then, slowly, a look of determination came over his face. "You're right. This doesn't have to be a disaster. It could be an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" Margaret asked. Alexander stood, energy radiating from him. "An opportunity to reshape my image, to use my platform for something meaningful. Margaret, how would you feel about going public with our story?" Margaret blinked, taken aback. "You mean, tell everyone?" "Yes," Alexander nodded. "We control the narrative. We share our story on our terms, and then we use it to make a difference." "What do you have in mind?" Margaret asked, intrigued. Alexander's eyes were alight with purpose. "A foundation. One that supports older workers, fights against ageism in the workplace. We could help people like you, Margaret, people with a lifetime of experience and wisdom to offer." Margaret felt a swell of pride. This was the man she'd always hoped her son would become, someone who used his power and influence to help others. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Alexander." He smiled, squeezing her hand. "Then let's do it. Together." As they began to plan their announcement, Margaret marveled at how quickly things had changed. A week ago, she'd been Alexander's housekeeper, silently longing for a connection. Now, she was his partner in a new venture, his mother in more than just biology. There would be challenges ahead, she knew. Their relationship was still new and fragile, and the public scrutiny would be intense. But for the first time in 50 years, Margaret felt truly whole. She had found her son, and together they were going to make a difference in the world. Alexander's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Margaret, are you ready for this?" She looked at him, seeing not just the powerful businessman, but also the little boy she'd held so briefly all those years ago. With a smile, she nodded. "Ready as I'll ever be. Let's face this together." The press conference was set for the following afternoon. As Margaret stood backstage, smoothing her newly purchased dress, a gift from Alexander, she felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This would change everything, not just for her and Alexander, but potentially for countless others. "You look lovely," Alexander said, appearing beside her. He was dressed in his usual impeccable suit, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Margaret smiled nervously. "Thank you. I'm not used to all this attention." Alexander squeezed her hand. "You'll do fine. Just remember, we're in this together." As they stepped out onto the stage, camera flashes erupted like lightning. The room fell silent as Alexander approached the podium, Margaret at his side. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "I've called this press conference to address the recent speculation about my personal life and to share some important news." He paused, taking a deep breath. "The rumors are true. Margaret Wilson, who has worked as my housekeeper for the past few months, is indeed my biological mother." A burst of excited murmurs filled the room. Alexander held up a hand for silence. "Our reunion was unexpected and, quite frankly, overwhelming for both of us. But it has also been a catalyst for change that I believe will have a positive impact far beyond our personal lives." He gestured for Margaret to join him at the podium. She stepped forward, her heart racing. "Margaret gave me up for adoption when she was just a teenager," Alexander continued. "She made an incredibly difficult decision out of love, wanting to give me a chance at a better life. While I can't change the past, I can shape the future, which is why I'm announcing the creation of the New Beginnings Foundation." The room buzzed with interest as Alexander outlined the foundation's mission: to support older workers, fight age discrimination, and create opportunities for those who often find themselves overlooked in today's job market. Margaret's strength, wisdom, and unwavering work ethic have opened my eyes to the untapped potential of our older workforce, Alexander said. "It's time we recognize and value the experience and skills they bring to the table." As the press conference concluded and they retreated backstage, Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. "You were wonderful out there," she told Alexander. He smiled, a hint of his old cockiness returning. "We both were. Now, are you ready for Phase 2? Phase 2, as it turned out, was a whirlwind of interviews, photo shoots, and meetings with potential partners for the foundation. Margaret found herself thrust into a world she'd never imagined, one of influence, power, and the opportunity to make real change. One afternoon, as they were leaving a meeting with a group of corporate sponsors, Alexander turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression. "You know, I've been thinking," he said. "It doesn't make sense for you to keep living in that small apartment. Why don't you move into the mansion? There's more than enough room." Margaret's eyes widened. "Oh, Alexander, I couldn't possibly." "Nonsense," he cut her off. "You're my mother, not my housekeeper anymore. Besides, it would be easier for us to work on the foundation if we're under the same roof." Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. "If you're sure, then, yes, I'd love to." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Margaret moved into the east wing of the mansion, marveling at the spaciousness of her new accommodations. She and Alexander fell into a comfortable routine, sharing breakfast each morning before diving into foundation work. As they worked side by side, Margaret began to see new sides of her son. His brilliant mind, so often focused on profit margins and market shares, now turned its attention to social issues with the same intensity. She watched with pride as he used his business acumen to create innovative programs and partnerships. One evening, as they sat in the study reviewing applications for the foundation's first round of grants, Alexander looked up with a smile. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad things turned out this way," he said. "Finding you, starting this foundation, it's given me a purpose I didn't even know I was missing." Margaret felt her heart swell. "I'm glad too, Alexander. More than you could ever know." As the weeks turned into months, the New Beginnings Foundation began to make real waves. Companies across the country were implementing new hiring practices, creating mentorship programs that paired older workers with younger employees, and rethinking their approach to retirement. Margaret found herself becoming a sought-after speaker, sharing her story and advocating for change. She marveled at how life had come full circle, from a young girl forced to give up her child, to a housekeeper reunited with her son, to a respected voice for social change. But success, as always, came with its own set of challenges. As the foundation's profile grew, so did the scrutiny. Critics accused Alexander of using the foundation as a PR stunt to distract from his company's less savory business practices. Others questioned Margaret's qualifications, suggesting she was nothing more than a figurehead. One particularly scathing article sent Margaret into a spiral of self-doubt. As she sat in her room, the magazine open on her lap, she heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called, hastily wiping her eyes. Alexander entered, concern etched on his face. "I saw the article," he said quietly, sitting beside her on the bed. "Are you okay?" Margaret sighed. "I don't know. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm in over my head here. I'm just a housekeeper after all." "No," Alexander said firmly, taking her hand. "You're so much more than that. You're smart, compassionate, and you understand the challenges facing older workers in a way no MBA ever could. This foundation needs you. I need you." His words, so heartfelt and sincere, brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes. But this time, they were tears of gratitude and love. "Thank you, Alexander," she whispered. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that I found you, that we're doing all this together." Alexander smiled, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. "I know what you mean. For so long, I thought I had to do everything alone, but now—" He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Now I have a mother, a real mother." The words hung in the air between them, full of meaning. It was the first time Alexander had referred to her as his mother without qualifiers or context, just a simple, powerful acknowledgement of their bond. Margaret's heart soared. Tentatively, she opened her arms, and to her joy, Alexander leaned in, allowing her to embrace him. As she held her son, truly held him, for the first time in 50 years, Margaret felt a sense of completion she'd never known before. "We'll face whatever comes together," she murmured, stroking his hair. "Mother and son." Alexander nodded against her shoulder. "Together," he agreed. As they pulled apart, both a little misty-eyed, Alexander cleared his throat. "So, I was thinking, how would you feel about expanding the foundation's focus? Maybe looking into programs for young single mothers, giving them the support you never had?" Margaret beamed, her earlier doubts forgotten in the face of this new challenge. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Where should we start?" As they began to brainstorm, their excitement building, Margaret marveled at how far they'd come. From employer and employee to mother and son, from strangers to partners in a shared mission. Whatever the future held, she knew they would face it as a family forged not just by blood, but by choice, understanding, and love. As the New Beginnings Foundation approached its one-year anniversary, Margaret and Alexander found themselves busier than ever. The foundation's success had exceeded their wildest expectations, with programs running in cities across the country and a growing list of corporate partners eager to implement age-inclusive policies. One crisp autumn morning, as Margaret sipped her tea in the sunroom, Alexander burst in, his face alight with excitement. "We did it!" he exclaimed, waving a tablet in the air. "Forbes just named us one of the top 10 most influential foundations of the year." Margaret's eyes widened. "That's wonderful news, Alexander." He sat down beside her, scrolling through the article. "They're particularly impressed with our mentorship program. Listen to this. The New Beginnings Foundation has revolutionized the way companies view older employees, transforming them from liabilities into invaluable assets." As Alexander read on, Margaret felt a surge of pride. They had come so far in such a short time. But more than the foundation's success, she marveled at the change in her son. The hard-edged businessman was still there, but he had softened, found purpose beyond profit margins. "We should celebrate," Alexander said, setting down the tablet. "How about dinner tonight, just the two of us?" Margaret smiled. "That sounds lovely. But don't you have that board meeting this evening?" Alexander waved a hand dismissively. "I'll reschedule. This is more important." His words warmed Margaret's heart. A year ago, nothing would have been more important than a board meeting. Now here he was, prioritizing time with her. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it spoke volumes about how far their relationship had come. That evening, as they sat in a cozy corner of Alexander's favorite restaurant, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on their journey. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, swirling her wine glass thoughtfully, "what might have happened if I hadn't taken that housekeeping job? If we'd never found each other?" Alexander considered this for a moment. "I used to think about that a lot, actually, but now, I don't know. I think maybe we were always meant to find each other, one way or another." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I didn't think you believed in fate." "I didn't," Alexander chuckled. "But after everything that's happened, well, let's just say I'm more open to the idea." As they continued their meal, the conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from foundation business to childhood memories. Margaret shared stories of her youth, filling in the blanks of Alexander's family history. In turn, he opened up about his struggles growing up in the foster system, his drive to succeed, and the loneliness that had plagued him even at the height of his success. "You know," Alexander said as they were finishing dessert, "I've been thinking about the future, about legacy." Margaret tilted her head, curious. "Oh," he nodded, a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "I've decided to step down as CEO of my company. I want to focus full-time on the foundation." Margaret's jaw dropped. "Alexander, are you sure? Your company is your life's work." "It was," he agreed. "But now I have something more important. The foundation, yes, but also—" He reached across the table, taking her hand. "Also you, us, this family we're building." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "Oh, Alexander, I've spent my whole life chasing success," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've realized that true success isn't about money or power. It's about making a difference, about connections, and I want to spend whatever time I have left focusing on that." Margaret squeezed his hand, her heart full. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "So incredibly proud." As they left the restaurant, walking arm in arm down the quiet street, Margaret felt a sense of peace she'd never known before. They had faced so many challenges, public scrutiny, personal doubts, the weight of their shared past, but they had come through it all stronger, closer. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity as Alexander transitioned out of his role at the company and dove headfirst into foundation work. Margaret watched with pride as he poured the same energy and brilliance that had built his business empire into their shared mission. One day, as they were preparing for a major fundraising gala, Alexander called Margaret into his study. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small velvet box and handed it to her. Margaret opened it, gasping at the sight of a delicate gold locket. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Open it," Alexander urged gently. Inside, she found 2 photos. On one side was a picture of Alexander as a baby, the photo she had glimpsed in his room all those months ago. On the other side was a recent photo of the 2 of them, heads bent together as they worked on foundation plans. "I thought you might like to have this," Alexander said softly, "to carry with you, a reminder of our journey." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks as she clasped the locket around her neck. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling him into a hug. "My son, my wonderful son." As they embraced, Margaret marveled at how far they had come, from strangers to family, from a relationship built on secrets to one founded on trust and shared purpose. They had found each other against all odds, and in doing so, had not only healed their own wounds, but had set out to heal others. The gala that evening was a resounding success. As Margaret stood at the podium, sharing her story with a room full of potential donors, she felt Alexander's presence beside her, a steady source of strength and support. "When I gave up my son 50 years ago," she said, her voice carrying across the hushed room, "I thought I was giving him his best chance at life. I never dreamed that one day we would be reunited, that we would have the opportunity to not only rebuild our relationship, but to make a difference in the lives of so many others." She turned to Alexander, who stepped forward to join her at the microphone. "Together," he continued, "we've learned that it's never too late for a new beginning. Whether you're a teenager facing an impossible choice, a retiree looking for purpose, or anyone in between. There's always hope, always a chance to rewrite your story. As applause filled the room, Margaret felt a sense of completion she'd never known before. She had spent so many years wondering about the child she'd given up, hoping she'd made the right choice. Now, seeing the man Alexander had become, the work they were doing together, she knew that everything had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Later that night, as they stood on the balcony of the mansion, looking out over the city lights, Alexander turned to Margaret with a smile. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we took a break. A vacation, just the two of us. We could visit that small town you grew up in, see where it all began." Margaret's heart swelled at the suggestion. "I'd love that," she said softly. "A chance to show you where you came from, to introduce you to your roots." Alexander nodded, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "And a chance for us to just be us, mother and son. No foundation, no press, no expectations, just family." As they stood there basking in the warmth of their newfound bond, Margaret realized that they had achieved something truly remarkable. They had taken a lifetime of separation, of missed opportunities and unspoken longings, and transformed it into a force for good. Their pain had become purpose. Their loss had led to countless new beginnings for others, and in each other, they had found what they had both been searching for all along: unconditional love, acceptance, and the unbreakable bond of family. As Margaret and Alexander's plane touched down in the small Midwestern town where she had grown up, a wave of nostalgia washed over her. The landscape was both familiar and strange, changed by time yet still holding echoes of her youth. "So this is where it all began," Alexander mused, peering out the window as they drove from the airport in their rental car. Margaret nodded, pointing out landmarks as they passed. "That's the high school I attended, and over there, that's where the drive-in theater used to be. Oh, I can't believe it's still standing." Alexander listened intently, soaking in every detail. This wasn't just a trip down memory lane for Margaret. It was a chance for him to connect with a part of his own history he'd never known. They checked into a quaint bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town, run by a cheerful elderly couple who didn't seem to recognize Alexander or make the connection to the headlines that had splashed across national news a year ago. It was refreshing to be treated as just another mother and son on vacation. The next morning, after a hearty homemade breakfast, Margaret and Alexander set out to explore the town. Their first stop was the small farm where Margaret had grown up. As they stood at the edge of the property, Margaret's eyes misted over. "It's smaller than I remember," she said softly. "But then I suppose everything seems bigger when you're young." Alexander squeezed her hand. "Can you tell me about it? What was it like growing up here?" Margaret smiled, letting the memories wash over her. She told him about summer days spent climbing trees and chasing fireflies, about helping her father with the harvest, and her mother with canning preserves. She spoke of the simple joys and the hard work, painting a picture of a life so different from the one Alexander had known. As they walked through the town, Margaret pointed out other significant places: the church where she'd sung in the choir, the diner where she'd had her first job as a waitress, the park where she'd shared her first kiss. "And over there," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "that's where I found out I was pregnant with you." Alexander followed her gaze to an unremarkable street corner. "What happened?" he asked gently. Margaret took a deep breath. "I was walking home from school. I'd been feeling sick for weeks, but I was in denial. Then I saw Mrs. Thompson. She was the town midwife. She took one look at me and just knew. She pulled me aside right there on that corner and told me I needed to see a doctor." Alexander was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then he asked, "Were you scared?" "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "But also there was a part of me that was excited, even though I knew I couldn't keep you, even though I knew how hard it would be. For those few months you were mine, my little secret, my little miracle." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, and Alexander pulled her into a hug right there on the sidewalk. They stood like that for a long moment, embracing not just each other but also the weight of their shared history. As the day wore on, they found themselves in the town cemetery. Margaret led Alexander to a simple headstone. "These are your grandparents," she said softly. "My parents." Alexander knelt down, tracing the names with his fingers. "I wish I could have known them," he said. "They would have loved you," Margaret assured him. "They were good people, strict sometimes, but loving. They wanted me to give you up for adoption because they thought it was best for both of us. But I know it broke their hearts too." As they stood there, paying their respects, a thought occurred to Alexander. "Mom," he said, the word still new and precious on his tongue, "what if we set up a scholarship, in their name, through the foundation, for young single mothers who want to continue their education?" Margaret's face lit up. "Oh, Alexander, that's a wonderful idea. They would be so proud." The rest of their vacation was filled with similar moments of connection and healing. They visited Margaret's old school, where Alexander insisted on taking a photo of her behind her old desk. They spent an afternoon at the local library, poring over yearbooks and newspaper clippings, piecing together the story of Margaret's youth. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the bed and breakfast, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Alexander turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking about names." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh," Alexander nodded. "I've always gone by Alexander Rothschild. It's the name my adoptive parents gave me. But now, I'm wondering if I should change it." "Change it?" Margaret echoed, surprised. "To what?" "Well," Alexander said, a hint of nervousness in his voice, "I was thinking maybe Alexander Wilson Rothschild, to honor both sides of my heritage." Margaret felt her heart swell with emotion. "Oh, Alexander," she breathed. "Are you sure?" He nodded, taking her hand. "I am. For so long, I tried to distance myself from my past, from the uncertainty of my origins. But now I want to embrace all of it, the good and the bad, the known and the unknown. You're my mother, and I want the world to know that—" Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she pulled him into a fierce hug. "I would be honored," she whispered. As their vacation drew to a close, both Margaret and Alexander felt a profound shift in their relationship. The awkwardness that had lingered even after their initial reunion had melted away, replaced by a deep understanding and affection. On their last night in town, they decided to have dinner at the local diner where Margaret had once worked. As they slid into a booth, the elderly waitress did a double-take. "Maggie?" she exclaimed. "Maggie Wilson, is that you?" Margaret laughed, standing to hug the woman. "Betty? Oh my goodness, I can't believe you're still working here." As the two women caught up, Alexander watched with a smile. Seeing his mother in her element, surrounded by the memories and people of her past, he felt a sense of completeness he'd never known before. When Betty finally turned her attention to him, Margaret beamed with pride. "Betty, I'd like you to meet my son, Alexander." Betty's eyes widened in recognition. "Your son? The one who—" She trailed off, glancing between them uncertainly. "The one I gave up for adoption all those years ago," Margaret confirmed. "We found each other again, Betty. And now we're making up for lost time." As they shared their story over burgers and milkshakes, Alexander marveled at the twists and turns of fate that had brought them to this moment. From a scared teenage girl and an unwanted baby, to a powerful CEO and a humble housekeeper, and now to this, a mother and son, reunited against all odds, working together to make the world a little bit better. On the flight home, as Margaret dozed in the seat beside him, Alexander pulled out his tablet and began to type. The words flowed easily, telling the story of their journey, not just the past year, but the 50 years that had come before, the pain, the longing, the missed opportunities, and finally, the joy of reconnection. He wasn't sure what he would do with this story. Perhaps it would become a book, or maybe just a private record for their family. But he knew it was important to capture it all, to honor the path that had led them here. As the plane began its descent into the city they now both called home, Alexander gently woke Margaret. She blinked sleepily, then smiled as she saw the familiar skyline through the window. "We're home," she murmured. Alexander nodded, taking her hand. "Yes, we are. Both of us, together." As they disembarked and made their way through the airport, Alexander's phone buzzed with messages and emails, the outside world intruding on their bubble of familial bliss. But for once, he didn't feel the usual stress and pressure. Instead, he felt grounded, centered. Because now, no matter what challenges lay ahead, for the foundation, for his personal life, for anything, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. He had Margaret by his side, a steadfast presence, a source of unconditional love and support. And Margaret, as she watched her son navigate the crowd with confidence, felt a deep sense of peace. The hole in her heart, the one she'd carried for 50 long years, was finally filled. She had found her son, and in doing so, had found a new purpose, a new chapter in life when she'd thought all her stories had already been written. As they stepped out into the sunlight, ready to return to their shared life and their important work, both Margaret and Alexander knew that while their journey of reunion might be complete, their journey as a family was only just beginning. And they were ready to face whatever came next, together.